and it's a pleasure. And it is now recording. I will make reference to that. Got it. Excited to bring to you today a really exciting webinar on a very important topic. Just to confirm that you're in the right location, the theme of this webinar will be scientific research and experimental development, commonly known as SR&ED. And part of the reason we're excited is that this is our first event webinar that we're doing in partnership with EY, as this aligns to their recently launched EY America's Mining and Metals Center of Excellence. And we're excited, although you can't see him, we're excited to have the head of the Center of Excellence and head of Mining and Metals for EY, Theo Yamiogo, on the call today. His picture looks a lot like an EY logo for those that are scrolling through pictures, but he is a real person, just behind that logo for now. Before I introduce our two speakers for today, I just want to give some context here. Given the spirit of the Center of Excellence at EY, focused on mining and metals and the partnership with NORCAT, the individuals that we've invited to this really have a strong focus, obviously, on mining and tech. So we're excited that you're here today. And both Sean and Kevin have spent the time to really customize this presentation to ensure that the examples and the relevancy aligns to mining. And we just feel as though, while SR&ED is something that many of you might be familiar with, might be taking advantage of, there are some changes, there are some new opportunities, and having one really focused on tech and mining, we thought would be a great opportunity. As you may see in your top corner of your screen, this session is being recorded. So if you have any concerns that you might have to drop off, or you're keen to watch this later, it will be posted and made available both through NORCAT and EY. And as we proceed through the session today, we would encourage you, if you have any questions, given it's a small, again, handpicked invited group for today, we would encourage you to use the chat feature. And how that will work is, if Kevin and or Sean, whomever is not speaking, sees the question and has an opportunity to pounce on an answer and maybe have a bit of a digression, they will endeavor to do so. However, if they are in a flow, my job will be to look at the questions and aggregate them. And we've saved about 10 minutes at the end to do our best to address those questions. In the event that we don't get to a question that you have, I will ensure that it gets documented, and be it through NORCAT or Kevin and Sean at EY, we will do our best to follow up and provide you the answers. In addition to the recording, all registrants will have the option to review the deck, as we will email it out after, so you can have a hard copy PDF as part of your files. So I think I've covered off, kind of the core focus for today, a bit of the nuances of the session and how to do the Q&A. So without any further ado, we'll just flip to the next slide, and I'll just do a brief introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Kevin and Sean. The key summary I'll have here is we are very excited and very appreciative of the opportunity to kind of co-host this event. Both Kevin and Sean, as you'll see, have exceptional experience both in mining technology as well as in SR&ED and tax advisory. So I'll turn it over to them, and we look forward to the presentation, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. My name's Kevin Eck. I guess I'll introduce myself first, a little bit of a deeper dive. I'm a chemical engineer by trade, professional engineer registered in the provinces of BC and Ontario. Been in the resource sector since 1986, but joined EY 17 years ago and have been doing the business tax incentives and SR&ED tax credits for 17 years, and have quite a bit of experience, obviously, in the mining sector. Sean, you want to do a little introduction?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for that, Kevin. I've been with EY a little over 6 years now. My background is also, I'm an engineer, and I've been in the SR&ED world for, I think it's about 13 or 14 years now. I actually started at the CRA as a scientific auditor, and then moved over into the consulting world. I had my own company for a little while, and Kevin recruited me and brought me over to the EY team to look after the mining sector across Canada. And so that's my role right now. With that, I would maybe just highlight, on our team nationally, we have probably one of the most experienced teams across Canada, with a little over 1,200 years in the workforce. We got a bunch of post-grads, obviously, 107 years of graduate school. I have my master's degree. We have people with PhDs, a lot of really smart people, and probably the most interesting number on that square there is nearly 600 years of experience working in SR&ED. So we take pride in that number, and we look forward to sharing some stuff with you today. So Kev, maybe you want to highlight or bring us into just what is SR&ED at the highest level.
Sure. Yeah, and just Sean, just to your comment too about the number of years of experience. What also that goes into, we have over 80 people across the country. So we have people covering every province. So local as well as our sector specific experience that Sean and I possess, particularly in mining. So what is SR&ED? So SR&ED has been around for a long time. It is a Canadian tax incentive program. Started out in the early 80s, and of course its goal is to encourage research and development activities within Canada, which will then create more jobs, create more intellectual property, create more GDP for Canada. That's the high level. It is in the Income Tax Act. So as I said, it has been around for quite some time. It is administered by the Canadian Revenue Agency. So as Sean alluded to, he got his start as an auditor at the CRA from the science side, specifically looking at the projects that are submitted and whether they meet the eligibility criteria or not. So it is administered by the CRA, and every once in a while, they do have some slight changes on how they're administering the program. But that's what you have us for, to let you know what the changes and what the behavior is of the CRA and how they're administering the program. So the benefits itself and why should you do this? There are both federal and provincial income tax credits that are available. And depending on your company's situations and your geographical region where you're doing the work, some of them are refundable, some of them are non-refundable tax credits, which are applied against taxes payable. And they can be applied back 3 years or forward 20 years, a lot of these tax credits. So it is the federal government's largest research and development initiative, where over $5 billion is spent by the, not spent, but dispersed by the federal and provincial governments every year. So it is a very beneficial program in Canada. It is one that has been copied by other countries of the world as well. When I started in SR&ED 17 years ago, there was about 5 or 6 countries that had programs of this ilk, and now there's over 30 countries that have similar programs, a lot of them using the basis for the Canadian program itself. So from a benefit to the industry itself, depending on, again, on your geographic region and the size of your company, benefits can range from 15% right up to 48%. As I said, some are refundable, some are non-refundable. This map here just gives a rough idea of the federal rate is a base 15%. So you're going to get the 15% no matter where you are in Canada. The top-ups that maybe go as high as 48% depend on the stacking of provincial credits. The stacking means you can put those on top of the federal credit that you receive, as well as whether you're a Canadian-controlled private corporation or whether you're an international, public corp or something like that. The rates are going to vary as well. So there are enhanced rates for smaller companies because the federal government and the provincial governments as well do want to give a leg up to some of the startup companies and the smaller companies and smaller businesses throughout the country.
Perfect. Okay, so now we're just going to go through some of the unique program features or what's interesting about this program. So the first one here is you can make claims retroactively, but because it's a tax program, it's based on your tax year end. So it says here 18 months after your fiscal year end. So to make numbers easy, if you have a December 31st year end, generally your taxes are due within 6 months. So they're due by June 30. You have an additional 12 months to file your SR&ED. So you can basically go back as long as you have 18 months, to do that. And this wasn't the case, and for a while, but they've mandated now, and it's basically a statute bar deadline. So this is a deadline that cannot be moved, and so you have to file within inside of this 18-month deadline. Kev, you're on mute, by the way. I know you're.
Yep, thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
Another one of the features of the program is it is broadly applicable to all companies and industries in Canada operating in any field of science and technology. So some of the grants, programs that you may have read about from the federal budget or recent provincial budgets are discretionary, which means you apply for them, they decide whether they like your project or and they want to award you any money, and they do. So those are not necessarily dispersed to everybody. Here it is, if you are a Canadian taxable company, you're doing the work, it's going to apply to you.
Yeah, and it's eligible in many fields of science or technology. Today's talking about mining, but obviously I think there's 200 different categories that are considered eligible. Some of them that aren't would be like the social sciences, and there's specific programs for that too. This program also is very interesting in that it respects competition, which basically means, mining company A and mining company B could both be trying to do the same thing and both be doing, similar types of technological advancements, and both can apply and receive the tax credits. Obviously, unless obviously it's been produced publicly or it's been disclosed publicly, but we see this a lot in the mining industry. As head grades tend to go down and down and down, a lot of companies are doing very similar research, and many of them are using different providers who come to them with different technologies saying, hey, I think we might have a unique solution to your problem. And by having that unique solution, every mine site or every ore mix is a little bit different. So sometimes there's experimental development that's required to basically evaluate or try to understand that technology.
Another thing that's eligible there as well is reverse engineering is also eligible. So if a competitor has a product or a solution, but it's patented or they're not sharing it publicly, and you're trying to match that performance and reverse engineer it, that is eligible work as well, because there is the technological uncertainty that still exists there, and that you have to do some experimental work to even try to match that particular product or that level that the competitor has. So the last thing, and a lot of people are very concerned about this, I talked a little bit about patented technologies, is confidentiality is preserved within both your service provider like at EY as well as the CRA. The SR&ED department of the Canadian Revenue Agency operates as a standalone department within. They have their own data banks and data servers and stuff, so no information is shared publicly whatsoever if you submit under this program, nor are any of the reports shared anywhere else. So you don't have to publicly disclose anything. It goes to that one department within the CRA, and so the confidentiality is preserved for all claimants.
The next one here is a lot of times we get asked this question. It's like, well, what if it doesn't work? That's actually encouraged. Is if you're trying something or pushing beyond the limits, and possibly failure or failed attempts happen, that can basically represent new knowledge or a new understanding. And so if you're having projects that maybe are failing or there's the potential for possible failure, this is a program that actually rewards that.
And the other thing is there is no cap as well on any of the work that you do here. If you do the work, submit for the credits as much or as little as you have, there is no restriction on that, which is nice. So it says grants and other discretionary incentives sometimes have we're only going to go up to 20% of your costs, or we're going to cap it at $1 million or something. That is not the case under the SR&ED program.
Yeah, if you're eligible, you get the amount you're eligible. That's the nice thing about being a tax credit instead of a grant like IRAP, for example. And that leads us to our next one, which is, this is not a grant. This is a program that is available to all taxpayers, and it's available at the rates in each of those provinces. And I'll cover this last one here. It's also a very mature program. It's been around since the mid-'80s. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. Lots of companies actually depend on this now, or they've booked it into their methodology of how they operate as a business. And it's probably not going anywhere. Honestly, with the way the government is currently talking about R&D and advancing, developing Canada's R&D economy, it might even get enhanced in the future. That we'll see what happens, with the way the government works.
And we find, particularly in the mining space as well, that a lot of companies maybe don't think about SR&ED because, in the early years of getting a mine into production, they may be in a tax loss position. They may not realize that there are refundable credits available to them, or they may say, well, I don't need tax credits right now, and my mine life is only 10 years, so I don't realize I'm not going to bother with the time on that. And by the time they get to a point where they really could use the tax credits, it's too late in some cases. So it's something to factor in if you're going to have a profitable mine, which we all hope you do, that you'll factor in these credits as you're doing the work. So
yeah, no, that's perfect. So before I dive into the definition of SR&ED, is there any questions just on that prior stuff? I did a quick look at the chat. There was nothing in there, but I guess Don will just keep monitoring that. But if there are ever conversations, please feel free to throw them in the chat. And what we're going to do is we're going to dive into a little bit of what is SR&ED and what just exactly how does it work with respect to the program. So we got this slide here. We put it in every presentation. I don't really like to read it, but it's basically verbatim right out of the Income Tax Act. And we've highlighted the key words inside of there in yellow. And the reason they're highlighted is because they're going to come up inside the next 3 or 4 slides. But basically, we're looking for systematic investigation or search, experiment or analysis, advancing scientific knowledge, achieving technological advancement. These are the types of buzzwords that the CRA likes to hear. And now we're going to dive into the typical SR&ED process of what that looks like and maybe what it sounds like more when you're talking about it from a day-to-day versus the way the CRA puts it in the Income Tax Act.
One of the other things that is sort of hidden at the bottom there that people sometimes miss is incremental improvements.
Yeah,
is fine. We do not have to reinvent the wheel here. If you're attempting to make things better, make an improvement in your process or your product, that's good enough. That's just incremental.
Yeah. Yeah. So the typical SR&ED process. This is the cycle that we would typically see at most of our clients and most companies for that matter is generally there's a problem or there's a question or something that's like, oh, I'm not really sure how to solve this. And so that's how almost every SR&ED project starts. And from there, there's usually an idea or there's a solution or what the CRA likes to call a hypothesis is, okay, we have a potential idea here. Let's now let's have a look at that. From there, typically a plan or experimental plan gets developed. And usually once you have that plan, there's various experiments where you want to gather some data or you want to run a trial and you want to understand, to try and solve that problem or validate your hypothesis or in some cases invalidate your hypothesis. In order to do that, after you've run those experiments, you'll analyze the results and usually formulate some findings. And there's instances where, like on the left-hand side there, you've resolved your problem and the SR&ED is over. But in many cases, you start that cycle again. You revise your hypothesis, you develop a new plan, you run more experiments, and you go through that cycle. And the CRA likes to see that iterative cycle. And we show this picture first because the CRA has come up with what they call the 5-question test. Now, the 5-question test is relatively new. It came out, I believe, in 2014 or 15 when they came out with the 5 questions, or maybe it was a little bit later. But anyway, These are the 5 questions where the CRA says, if you answer all 5 of these positively, then you're most likely doing SR&ED. So we're going to go through each one of those.
And we won't read it. We'll give you the short version. But basically, the first one is there scientific or technological uncertainty? So, you know, then this is a challenge that could not be overcome with your traditional standard technologies, methods, processes, right? So you've encountered an issue, or you want to develop a new product, and the standard way of doing things won't work. So then you go to the next one. And the next one is, do I have an idea, as Sean alluded to earlier? Do I have a new idea on what I think might work to eliminate that uncertainty? That's, you know, okay, great, got an idea. Let's move on to, okay, let's come up with a plan to test that idea. And this is where the systematic investigation or search comes. So you go, okay, let's build a prototype, let's run a trial, let's hire a consultant to do a whole bunch of data collection and analysis for us. So you have the plan, you run the plan. So it's you ask a question, gather information, you get the idea, you test it, analyze the results, and then you decide, okay, what did I learn there? And again, as Sean said earlier, positive or negative does not matter. The CRA is giving you the credits for what you learned through this process. So I learned that is the crappy way to make a light bulb, or whatever it is. Okay, great. Or that's, you know, we've just achieved, you know, the greatest rocket ship to the moon here. Fantastic. So so the advancement is really what you learned, not necessarily that you achieved, you know, something that is much more improved. Those 4 questions are the process, and at the end, the CRA likes to see documentation, and they feel that you know, if it's an important learning that you've made, you probably wrote it down somewhere. You probably wrote down a plan. If you had to send you know, instructions to the floor for guys to run a trial, you probably sent them a memo or had a plan document. And so the CRA likes to see the document that supports that systematic investigation, and then they're happy, and then they approve everything. So
basically, the CRA wants to say, okay, you did all this interesting stuff. If you had to do it again, would you have to go run and do all the same trials you just did? Or could you go back to your documentation and say, oh, that's how we solved that problem last time. Maybe let's build upon it for this next one. And if there's any, you know, the other thing we're hearing from the CRA regarding documents is they like it when people do SR&ED on purpose. Instead of looking back and saying, oh, I think I might have done SR&ED. Is they like that intent document at the outset. It's like, we're going to try do this, or this is what we're hoping to do. And so documentation has been, you know, a pretty important thing. And one of the ones we definitely hear these days is, well, show us that you tried to do SR&ED at the outset. And so that's something we've been hearing lately. So with that, we actually have a poll. So hopefully, we're 20 minutes in here. Hopefully nobody's asleep yet. So we decided run a poll, and Kelty's gonna bring it up using whatever we got to do inside. Okay, there we go. So you can choose, you know, multiple choice here. How many? Which is the most important question to answer? Now we know all 5 need to be yes, but my question to you is, which one is the most important? So we'll leave that for let's say 30 or 40 seconds here, and let's see what's happening. So looks like we got 6 people in so far. We'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds. I'm seeing stuff moving. Does everybody else see that? I don't know.
No, it's just us, Sean. I think it's just the hosts get to see the results, I think. I don't know.
I don't know either. I don't know what people are seeing, but people are clicking on things. I've never done this before. Okay, so looks like we got about half the people in. So I don't know, Kelty, if we end this, do we show it, or does everybody see it? Okay. So basically we got a nice mix here, and about 40, like I say, I'm seeing 42% on the technological uncertainty was the winner. And if you had to ask me, I would agree. Technological uncertainty is probably the most important question, because if you don't have a problem, The rest of them don't really matter. And a lot of what hits the hypothesis and investigation, advancement, and even the documentation, that happens a lot in a lot of engineering companies as a regular process. But it's that technological uncertainty where they can demonstrate there's an actual problem or there's a key piece missing to the state of the art that we want to be able to see that. So no, that's great.
Perhaps documentation came second from people that may have gone through a CRA review and realized that the CRA tends to focus a lot on documentation. But I agree with Sean, and if, from our experiences with CRA auditors, they like to establish technological uncertainty. If they can see that, the rest seems to follow fairly easily for them to grasp. But if they don't see a technological uncertainty at the outset, that can kill the review pretty early in the process. So,
agreed.
There is no real right answer there, guys. That was just for fun and just from what we think from our experiences. So.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well let's dive in now. So we've talked about the science side. Let's talk a little bit about the eligible cost categories, and we're gonna go high level on this. We're not gonna necessarily dive into the real details, but basically there's 4 buckets, let's say, of eligible cost categories. Now the first one is probably one of the easiest, which is labor. So this is your wages for T4 salaried employees. There's specified and non-specified, which basically means owners and non-owners. And the CRA likes to see that you've tracked your time in some sort of capacity towards a project. And now that could be time estimates or whatever, but basically as part of a project, you can capture the labor associated with it.
Other things we can capture are the materials that were used in the prosecution of the shred. So if you have anything that was purchased and consumed and destroyed during the execution, and that's very important. A lot of times people say, well, I bought a capital piece of equipment to run my test on. Well, if it's not consumed or destroyed, it will be ineligible. The CRA removed capital from the program in 2014. So the materials must be consumed, destroyed, or rendered valueless because of the shred. And if that's the case, then we can include them.
Perfect. Next up is contractors and third-party payments. So if you are getting contractors to help you do research. Now, a lot of the clients Kevin and I have are mining companies, and they use a lot of different interesting contractors, whether that's for environmental research or say geological modeling or other interesting chemical companies that are helping in the mining industry. There's a lot of different contractors who help out a lot of mining companies. So these mining companies, if they're doing an R&D project, they can claim some of those contractors. There's other service-oriented companies that maybe they'll farm out some IT, some software, software people to help them with different interesting stuff. So long story is contractors are claimable as eligible shred. And similarly, we say third-party payments here, and third-party payments are a little bit different than contractors. This is when payments get made to like research consortiums or research institutes, basically to conduct interesting R&D activities that you would have access to as the donor of this money, but you wouldn't necessarily lead it, but you have access to the R&D. So third-party payments and contractors are slightly different, but at the end of the day, it's money going from your company to another company that can be eligible for this.
The last bucket is overhead, which is kind of the catch-all last category for anything that was commensurate with the needs and directly in support of the shred. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if you had a cost that you wouldn't have incurred if it was not for this particular shred project, then it potentially could be an overhead cost. For example, we're running a trial, let's say within the crushing grinding stage of a typical mine, we would need a lot of energy to be able to run that process while we tested out our new idea and our new trial. Well, the energy is not a material or labor or contractor, but it is an overhead. So we could include the amount of energy used, the cost for that during the time that we ran that particular trial. So overheads, as I said, it's every case is unique, but you'd look at, okay, what else did we spend that was above and beyond what would be normally spent if we were just running normal production or normal process. Let's look at including that as well.
Yeah, and I'll add, there's actually two ways to claim overheads, and what Kevin just described is considered the traditional way of claiming overhead. For other companies that are maybe all labor-based, there's another way to claim overheads, and that's called the proxy method, where basically what they take is they take 55% of whatever you claimed for labor, and we just allocate directly that amount as overhead. And so that's a nice way, especially for, say, more labor-intensive companies, like maybe a service company to a mining company. They might be purely labor-based, and if that's the case, you can actually add on to your claim with the overhead costs just by bumping up the salaries by 55%. So that's another feature of the program. Next here we have these are what we call support work categories. So when we're looking at SR&ED, we have to ask ourselves, well, who was doing the work and what type of activity were they doing? Were they doing engineering activities, different design activities? Was there other operational research, etc.? And so these are the areas as defined by the Income Tax Act that we go looking, or we go talking to people about doing that core SR&ED work. And like Kevin said when he was talking in the previous slide, is the work here must be commensurate with the needs and directly in support of the SR&ED work. And that's the key on this slide. We don't have to necessarily give examples on everything here. I don't know, Kev, if you wanted to talk any more on that one. No. Good. So this next slide, Kev, I'll maybe let you go through it, but these are some kind of key indicators that SR&ED is happening.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that SR&ED is definitely happening, but when we go and talk to companies, we like to say, hey, what kind of activities are you doing to solve your problems, to improve your processes, develop new products? And if we hear any of these sort of terms, we kind of, our ears perk up a little bit. Like, are you thinking of patenting anything? Is there any patentable ideas that you have? Well, okay, there might be some experimental work associated with that. Are you having problems with with your process where your ROIs are terrible, and you've got a problem that the standard and traditional ways of trying to solve these problems are not working, and you're not able to get the recoveries or the grades out of the projects you're looking for? We like to say, okay, what have you been trying to do to overcome that problem? Where are your technical teams spending most of their time? If they've been working on one or two specific problems for most of the year, it indicates to us, okay, that must be a problem that's pretty hard to solve. There might be some SR&ED elements within that. Are you trying to integrate a whole bunch of different systems together and having all kinds of issues with that, and maybe bringing in consultants and contractors to help you solve that particular integration problem? Could be some there as well. Any area where if you're getting IRAP for something, great. IRAP gives you $6,000, let's say. That's awesome. But did you spend 30 grand on that project? So we want to make sure that the stacking goes on, where you can stack grants and incentives and other tax credits, so that you get the full benefit of the effort that you put forward. Anytime you're generating any type of prototypes, we'd love to hear about that. Experimental production trials in a commercial shop floor environment is something that is a sweet spot in the mining industry. People are trying to solve problems all the time. You can get indications in the lab, but you need to run it on a full commercial scale to determine the uncertainties and the system uncertainties associated with that. So we'd love to hear about that. Did you write a paper or go to a conference and give a presentation on anything cool that you've done? Like, we'd love to hear about that as well. And again, maybe there's a little bit of granting in there, but what is not you're getting any compensation for that we could potentially get some SR&ED credits on? And anytime there's third-party payments to research institutes, we want to say, okay, what was the participation of the claimant there? Did you just pay them some money and say, go do your stuff? Or did you say, you guys do this piece, we're going to do this piece, and then we'll capture the entirety of the project itself? So
perfect. No, that's great. And so before we get into this next section, where we got about 10 or 15 minutes left, we're going to get into some examples of SR&ED. Is there any questions just on what SR&ED is before we dive into maybe more mining specific examples? And I'm not seeing it. I'm just looking at the chat. Doesn't look like there's anything there. So what I think we'll do is Kelty, if you could bring up the poll. Generally in mining, we see there's 5 areas where basically, it starts in the exploration geology phase, where we're looking for the rocks. Then we get into the mining where we're capturing the ore, we're gathering it, whether it's open pit, underground. From there, it gets sent to the processing facility, whatever that might be, and the output of that is obviously typically some good stuff, or there's also some bad stuff, and that usually goes to tailings or waste rock piles. And then finally, there's always environmental concerns, and so that's kind of the life cycle of a mine. And so our question to you is in mining, which areas do you think you'd find SR&ED? So let's open up that poll for a minute here and see where everybody thinks you might find SR&ED. Looks like we got a little over half in already. It's looking pretty good. Okay. So we got about, looks like 75% have voted. And, this is kind of a trick question. Like, let's be honest. There's SR&ED in all of these areas. And, that's kind of the point of the question, is that every one of these areas, we see R&D happening. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, as head grade is getting lower and lower, as it's harder and harder to find the real deposits or find isolated veins or whatever that might be, there is literally research in all of these areas. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go through each of the 5 areas and just give maybe a high level example or two, but we've listed kind of 6 or 7 different things that we see in each of these areas. We're not going to talk about each one of them, but what we'll do is I think, like Don said at the outset, is we're going to provide this deck to you guys afterwards, and then you can have a look at them. But if we just start at the at the start here is exploration and geology. We've been seeing a lot lately of very interesting geometallurgical or ore body modeling. That's one of the biggest ones we've seen probably in the last 3 to 4 years. Is there's a lot of really interesting techniques being done out there, and a lot of it is related to different AI, different machine learning algorithms that are being used to try and understand the copious amounts of data that the various sensor technologies can provide. And so that's one of the cool ones we've been seeing here. And I don't know, Kev, if you wanted to highlight one of these.
Well, and this is one of the let's say the underclaimed areas with a lot of companies. And one of the reasons for that is if you go to the Income Tax Act, it prohibits the exploration for metals, minerals, right? So it prohibits it. So most people say, oh, exploration is out. But what we tend to look for is where you're attempting to improve your exploration techniques or the predictive modeling capabilities that you have on known deposits, right? So yeah, going out and saying, oh, we don't know what's out there, we're going to go look for some deposits. The CRA is going to go, that's not R&D, okay? Especially if you're using traditional methods and traditional technologies. But if you're saying, hey, we know we've got this ore body, 1.5 kilometers underground, what we're trying to do is the current capabilities of the technology, we're not really sure of the ore waste delineations. We want to get a better picture of it at depth. And so we developed these prototypes or improve our tools. And then we have to drill some holes down to see if we're right on the predictive, and we get more data and we figure out if we've actually improved the ability to detect ore bodies at depth. That's a SR&ED project, right? So this is an area, as I said, a lot of people just discount because, well, we're prohibited, we can't, that's out. But don't sell it short, because as Sean said, we're seeing a lot more in the past few years of a lot of geometallurgical modeling type projects where they're trying to improve predictive capability and to basically reduce dilution, and maximize the amount of ore that they're putting through the mill. So.
Yeah, perfect. Next up, we have, in the mine, and there's lots of interesting stuff that we've been seeing lately, whether it's, when I think of drilling, blasting, or fragmentation. At the end of the day, what many of the miners are trying is how do I reduce, my power factor, or how do I reduce the amount of explosive, but still get the fragmentation, and how is that going to affect the mill at the end? And so we see, interesting mine to mill trials sometimes, where there's experimentation happening in the mine, but it has to go all the way to the end of the mill to whether they can evaluate whether recovery was better or worse based on the different mining techniques. When you go underground, you might be seeing, we have been seeing different, caving or pillar removals. And there's stability both open and underground, and so there's lots of interesting stuff that can happen in the mine.
One of the key things there, as we alluded to earlier, is incremental improvements is all that needs to be done. So I reviewed a project last night around bench face angles, and we're not talking a lot. It may seem like that's a pretty minor improvement that this company was attempting, but they had a new idea that they were uncertain whether it was going to work or not. That's all so that technological uncertainty existed, and then they had as I said, they had the idea, they ran it, so it will qualify as shred.
Yeah. So once stuff leaves the mine, it usually heads to some sort of processing facility, whether that's smelting or milling or whatever. Inside of that facility, this is where we see a lot of and Kevin alluded to this earlier, experimental production. It's basically where you're treating the facility, you're treating the entire plant or the entire mill as a lab for maybe a day or 2 days, or maybe it's just a shift. But there's lots of different things that can happen depending on your flow sheet and whether you're dealing with different flotation experiments, or maybe you're modifying different particle sizes, or maybe you're doing different leaching methods or conditioning and frothing, or all of those different experiments, even if they're really incremental, or sometimes we'll even see is like we have chemical A, we're going to try chemical B, which technically is the same, but has just a slightly different chemical mix. Well, with the feedback that can happen in the plant, that could essentially put your plant at risk for a day, or maybe even a couple of days. And then back to experimental production basically says all the overhead costs of running that facility can now be considered an eligible cost because that plant was under risk for a certain duration of time. And so we see a lot, this is probably where we see the bulk of claims in mining, at least, mining companies, not necessarily on the service side, but the service companies are the ones who are feeding, honestly, all the new ideas to the mining companies. It's like, well, why don't you try this chemical, or why don't you try this coarse copper flotation technique, or whatever it might be, or different ore sorting, for example. Those types of techniques come in, and then the mining companies are like, okay, how do we incorporate that in our process? I don't know, Kev, if you had anything to add on that one.
No, you covered it pretty well.
Cool. All right, I'll let you go with tailings.
Yeah, so tailings, no surprise. I mean, that there could be some research in tailings, especially a few years ago, given the Mount Poly issue out here in BC, that it is certainly top of mind on as we start to, a lot of these mines, we're extending mine life. We're attempting to put and stack more and more tailings on a containment facility that maybe was rated for half of what you're putting in there now. There's obviously some issues around, okay, how do we prevent major disasters here? What kind of geotechnical investigations need to be done? How do we dewater it better, deposit it differently? What can we do to prevent seepage and leaching? What's going on at depth? Down below, is there some slippage or something? So there's a lot of we find a lot of these projects have a large amount of contractor and consultant costs associated with it, to bring in the experts to do these studies to say, yeah, you can get another 5 years out of this tailings containment facility. or there may be a contaminant of concern that the Ministry of Environment's concerned about, and you have to say, okay, how are we going to get the selenium out of this? Okay, here's our plan. So we see a lot of almost bordering on the applied research end of things in the tailings and waste rock as well. What's the seepage from your waste rock?
Yeah, I think as so many mining companies are extending their mine life, that's basically resulting in various tailings and waste rocks research happening, essentially, because now the tailings facility, which it wasn't designed for, now has to try and grow and deal with the extended mine life. And so how do we deal with that? And Mount Poly was a perfect example for everybody to do research in that to try and understand what's happening below the tailings facility. So, and last is the environment. Obviously, environment is extremely important, and as different mining companies or even just resource companies in general, this is probably one of the most important pieces of research that is going on right now. And whether that's looking at aquatic or wildlife effects, where it's looking at the flora and fauna, there's a lot of different interesting research, and the environment stuff sort of ties in a little bit with the tailings work as well. But there's all sorts of interesting research that's going on as reclamation efforts increase, and different interesting things. So I know we're getting a little bit tight. We wanted to get 10 minutes, hopefully, of questions. So I think, Kevin, unless you have anything more on environment, I think I'm going to push on to the next one here, which is
examples. I think that's good, Sean.
Yeah. So here's some examples specifically for those serving the mining industry. And some of our examples today were specifically for mining companies, but we looked at the attendee list and we thought we should probably highlight a little bit of interesting things for those who are serving the mining industry. And we highlight three different things here, which we put an example in there, but these are places where we find those serving the mining industry are sometimes forgetting or missing that they could be claiming R&D tax credits for this work. So if you're performing work for government entities, and I'll think of a great example, and the reason I know this one so well is because my a very close friend of mine works for the Yukon government, and they are reclaiming a few mines up there that basically have been abandoned, and now it's up to the federal and territorial government to reclaim these mines. But these are billion-dollar mine cleanups, and they have a ton of different environmental contractors who've been helping them, dealing with all sorts of issues. But like permafrost is a perfect issue that's becoming more and more up there as they're trying to reclaim this area. So if you're serving the federal government or a provincial government with respect to an interesting project, you could be claiming that shred even if the government is paying you to do that. And the reason being is the government can't claim that shred, so they want you to do that for them. So that's example number one.
Well, and this gets down to, Sean, to follow up on that is the concept of double dipping. Right? Yeah. There's a project that some shred happened on. Only one person or one claimant is going to get the credits for that. And so the CRA sometimes comes in and tries to figure out who owns the shred. Right. And so generally speaking, if you're a consultant to a mine company, let's say, and the mine company is paying you and they're a Canadian company, then you're deemed as a consultant on their shred claim. So you can't make a claim for all of that shred because you were paid for it. And so but the case, as Sean said, with government, the government can't claim shred tax credit. So right now, nobody owns the shred. So you get paid for it and claim the shred. And I'm going to skip over an example here, Sean, and go to the non-Canadian entities. Yeah. If you're doing work in Canada for a U.S. company or an African company or a European company, and they're paying you to do this work in Canada. So again, you have to be actually performing some of the analytical work or the modeling work or whatever you're doing in Canada, because this foreign company cannot claim the shred. You can, even though you're getting paid for it as well. You can claim all the hours and time spent on that. So it's the CRA is concerned about double dipping. But if nobody's going to claim the initial, then you're eligible for it. You can claim that.
Yeah, and no, I would have done the same, Kevin. And the other example that's stuck in the middle there is sometimes mining companies, they just want to purchase your technology, but it's your technology. You own the tech, you own that, and you developed it in-house. And I put ore sorting as an example there, because we see it at a lot of different mines we work at, or of course copper flotation was one, a few years ago, where it was coming into almost all the large copper producers. If you're the company that created that technology, there's a good chance it's your R&D. So there's just a few examples.
Well, I just want to finish one last thing too, is that, I have some friends, I used to work in the chemical industry, and I have some friends that still work for the chemical industry. And they're utilizing, we've had some talks with them, provided them with the information about the program, and they're using it to try to sell mining companies on using their chemicals, saying, look, it's going to cost you $100 grand to run this trial, but it will be eligible for shred. So you're going to get 25% back on that. And so it just makes the ROI for some of these companies to run their product a little bit better. So it's something that you can bring to some of these companies and say, hey, this could be a shreddable activity, which means the cost that you would actually put out was much lower than what the sticker price is. So. Yeah, and back to that experimental production example, they're running their facility anyway, so it might only cost even a small amount for a new chemical to be used, but they can claim the whole facility, so it actually covers the cost of that sometimes. Yeah. The last thing I got on here on our slides is we talked a little bit about documentation. I'm not going to go into these, but these are some of the examples that the CRA likes to see. At the end of the day, the CRA needs some sort of documentation. It ideally is contemporaneous, so it was kept track of, during the time. For new filers, the CRA is usually a little more lenient. For old filers, they kind of like to see documents that, all their things that are wrote. But I think our experience would say, if you're doing R&D, you just have this anyway. It's just a matter of what it looks like to you. And then, a company like us, we just work with what you got, and we help you. So that's our last slide. I'm going to leave with this slide here with basically this is our contact information, but no comments or things have come in the chat. I kind of put it over on the side window, so I haven't seen anything, but maybe Don, you got something there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, first and foremost, gents, thank you very much. I actually had two questions, kind of questions/comments coming to me direct, and perhaps under the intent of anonymity, so I'll keep it that way.
Yeah.
And apologies to whoever asked these. If I don't quite get it right, hopefully you will speak up. But ironically enough, gents, one of the ones that we kind of alluded to in our preamble before we invited people into the webinar this afternoon. And just wondering if you have any suggestions for Canadian tech companies that have part of their R&D being done in the United States. Is there any suggestions as to what they should be doing, fully appreciating in your presentation around shred applicability to Canadian T4able workers? I guess the question really is rooted in some of these entities are engaging activities that are American counterparts that are working for their company or a partnership. Is there anything that they, I guess, should be thinking about or doing, or any suggestions?
Well, I'll start with from a if you're hiring consultants, for example, the Canadian Shred program, if they're an American consultant, we cannot claim them under the Shred program. So one of the things that if you're faced with, should I hire an American consultant or a Canadian consultant, if you have that type of choice, factor in the fact you may be able to get 20 to 30% back on the Canadian consultant if you hire them, and that's part of the intent of the program. So you certainly can't get at foreign contractors. Now, if it's you have, let's say, workers for your company down in the States, doing the
okay, I think sorry, I'm just interrupting. I think it might have been the other way. I think it might be for a non-Canadian company that's thinking about about how to maximize SR&ED in Canada with potential Canadian operators. Is that what I heard, Don? Sorry, I just wanted to make sure.
No, it was more along the lines of Kevin, whereby
sorry, then
we are a Canadian tech company doing R&D.
Got it.
In the
Yeah. So the people in Canada doing the work, whether it's supervising or reviewing results, that they can certainly claim their time. If you have actually, employed people with your company that are being paid out of, let's say, a U.S. entity, then there are programs. There is a U.S. R&D program. It's not as beneficial as the Canadian program. The ITC rate is much lower, but there is a chance to get at some credits in the States. But you could not, you couldn't bring them up and throw them under the Canadian SR&ED. The work has to be performed in Canada by Canadian T4 employees. So
that being said, to like the Brazil example we brought up is if you are a Canadian company, you have Canadian people, but they got to go to Brazil to do a little bit of analysis or gather some data, but they bring that data back and then they do the bulk of the work in Canada. 10% of labor is allowed outside of Canada by Canadian employees. So some work could happen outside of the outside of Canada.
The only other one that came in is it's a pretty straightforward one, and I think I know the answer. But on one of the slides, there was an indication of I think it was the one around when SR&ED is happening, and you made mention of patents or patentable ideas. Does it have to involve something that's patentable, or could it just be general research that might never go down the patent path?
No,
okay.
It definitely does not need a patent. Patents are just an indicator. As you know, if you're running a patent, there's a good chance you're doing SR&ED, but just because you're not doing a patent, honestly, a lot of companies just don't have time to patent their things. They just would rather just get the work done or do the R&D and keep it. They would actually prefer to keep it quiet. In some.
And the bulk of the projects we claim are those incremental improvements, which may not meet the threshold for being patentable as well. So it's just, as Sean said, it's just an indicator.
Right. Okay. Well, gentlemen, rather, being mindful of time, Kevin and Sean, I want to thank you for taking some time to kind of give us a mining centric, and obviously near the end, a bit more insight into those selling into the mining industry, which I think you're right that many tech companies selling into mining might not be fully aware of the opportunities. So much appreciated on that. To those viewing today, thank you for participating. This will be the first of many of these joint, EY America's Mining and Metals Center of Excellence opportunities combined with NORCAT to really kind of listen to the tech community that we serve, to understand, what are the topics that you want to have. So by all means, feel free to provide us, feedback and insight. If you have any questions directly related to the presentation today, both Kevin and Sean have provided their contact information on the slide, so we encourage you to reach out, and you'll receive a follow-up with the deck as well as a kind of a URL as to where the document and presentation, the recording of it rather, where it will be available, so you have a chance to kind of revisit that. So, gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for your time. We know you're crazy busy. This was super helpful and interesting, maybe a refresher for those that already are familiar, but nonetheless, there's still value in that. And I don't know if there's any final thoughts from you, gents. Otherwise, I'll let people sign off.
Oh, that's great. We're both on LinkedIn if you want to connect with us there too. We know it's a digital world, so feel free to do that, and feel free to ask any questions. We're open.
Okay, wonderful.
It's been great working with NORCAT. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Don.
Okay, enjoy the day, everyone, and thank you for participating. Bye.
Okay.